So here we are again with light brown and spada. We're going to look at the L2 learner now and see what's going on. So the first thing to talk about is that document that I have in Brightspace for you, which is the first and second language acquisition for different kinds of learners: the young learner, the young child, the adolescent, and the adult on the job. And I'm just wondering how you filled out the learner characteristics and the learning conditions, so with your opinion. But there are definitely lots of differences in L2 learning between a child and an adult, even a teen. Cognitive differences, risk-taking differences, environmental differences in terms of subjection to the immersion language, target language, exposure differences in terms of time. Young learners are often allowed to be silent, and they may in class be singing, so their voices are blending with others and they get a lot of practice inadvertently. Parents respond to the meaning rather than the accuracy of a child. For adults, error feedback may only be in class, and teachers, English language teachers, often have teacher talk or foreigner talk, a kind of adjusted speech. And knowing how language develops helps us as teachers to assess our teaching procedures and our expectations for the language learner at all different levels and ages. For example, L1 and L2 learners usually learn past tense before the regular past tense. The irregular past tense they learn first before the regular. So I buyed a ticket may be showing more progress than I bought a ticket, because that just might be a chunk. So we also have to observe what they do, and L2 learners need to do more than just repeat and imitate. And this is where the idea of contrastive analysis, error analysis, and interlanguage comes in. So there are three things: contrastive analysis, error analysis, and interlanguage. So until the late 1960s, people tended to see L2 learners' speech simply as incorrect version of the target language. According to the contrastive analysis hypothesis, errors were assumed to be the result of transfer from the learner's first language. But that would be a prediction that when differences exist, errors would be bidirectional. For example, French speakers learning English and English speakers learning French would make errors on parallel linguistic features. But that just doesn't happen. For example, in simple English sentences, direct objects, whether nouns or pronouns, come after the verb. The dog eats the cookie, the dog eats it. But in French, direct objects that are noun follow the verb. Le chien mange le biscuit, and literally the dog eats the cookie. However, the direct object pronouns precede the verb. Le chien le mange, the dog it eats. So the contrastive analysis hypothesis would predict that a native speaker of English would make the error of saying le chien mange le when learning French, and that a native speaker of French might say the dog it eats when learning English. But in fact, English speakers learning French are more likely to make the predicted error than French speakers learning English. This may be due to the fact that English speakers learning French hear many examples of sentences with subject, verb, object, word order. For example, le chien mange le biscuit. And they make an incorrect generalization based both on word order of their first language and evidence from the second language that all direct objects come after the verb. But French-speaking learners of English, on the other hand, hearing and seeing no evidence that English direct objects precede verbs, do not tend to use the pattern from their first language. So it is not bidirectional. Another thing to think about is that the 70s brought about this idea of error analysis, and it involved descriptions of errors that the second language learners made. The goal of the research was to discover what learners really knew about language, and what Pitt Corder observed in 1967 was that when learners produce correct sentences, they may just simply be repeating something they already heard. When they produce sentences that differ from the target language, we assume that these sentences reflect learners' current understanding of the rules and patterns. And we saw this in the example of a learner who says buyed instead of bought. But error analysis differed from contrastive analysis, that it did not set out to predict errors. It sought instead to discover and describe the different kinds of errors in an effort to understand how learners process second language data. So error analysis was based on the hypothesis that, like child language, second language learner language was a system in its own right that's rule governed and predictable, and that appears to be true. So Selinker in 1972 came up with the term interlanguage to coin learners developing second language knowledge. And the analysis of learners' interlanguage shows that it has some characteristics influenced by previously learned languages, some characteristics of the second language, and some characteristics such as the omission of function words and grammatical morphemes that seem to be general and occur in all interlanguage systems. So he also talked about fossilization, which refers to the fact that some features in a learner's language seem to stop changing. This could be true especially for learners whose exposure to the L2 does not include instruction or feedback that really would help them recognize differences between their interlanguage and the target language. So here is an exercise for you to look at. These are texts, one written by an English learner who is French, and one by a Chinese English language learner. I want you to compare the two texts. You can stop the video and take a look at it, and then we'll look at the answer. So perhaps the most striking thing here is that many error types are common to both learners. Both make errors in spelling and punctuation that we might find in the writing system of a young first language speaker of English, even though the French uses grammatical morphemes to indicate person and number on verbs and Chinese does not. Both these learners make errors of subject-verb agreement, both leaving off the third person S marker and overusing it when the subject is plural. And such errors reflect learners' understanding of the second language system itself rather than an attempt to transfer characteristics of their first language. They are sometimes referred to as developmental errors because they are similar to those made by children acquiring English as their first language, which is why we had the first videos on children learning. Sometimes these errors are errors of overgeneralization, errors caused by trying to use a rule in a context where it doesn't belong. For example, the S ending on the verb in they plays. Sometimes the errors are better described as simplification when elements of a sentence are left out or where all verbs have the same form regardless of person, number, or tense. One can also see, especially in learner number 2's text, the influence of classroom experience. An example is the use of formulaic expressions such as one horse open sleigh, taken verbatim, probably from the Christmas song that had been taught in his class. The vivid dashing through the town probably comes from the same source, substituting town for snow. For those who are familiar with English spoken by native speakers of French, some of the errors, for example, the preposition choice in the same time made by the first learner will be seen probably as based on French. Similarly, those familiar with English of Chinese speakers may recognize some word order patterns. For example, on the back of his body has big packet. This is a Chinese pattern. These may be called transfer or interference errors. What is most clear, however, is that they are often difficult to determine in the source of the error. So while error analysis has advantage of describing what learners actually do rather than what they might do, it does not always give us clear insights as to why they do it. Furthermore, learners sometimes avoid using some features of language that they perceive to be difficult for them. Avoidance may lead to the absence of certain errors, leaving the analysis without information about aspects of the learner's developmental interlanguage. So the absence of particular errors is difficult to interpret, and the phenomena of avoidance may itself be part of the learner's systematic second language performance. I know that I do that myself in other languages, especially when I try to say something really complex. I just say it in the simplest possible way because I'm afraid I'll make a mistake if I say it in a more complex way. So continuing with the idea of analyzing the second language learner, there are grammatical morphemes that different speakers at different ages and from different language backgrounds are being used in ways that each learner has been studied. So researchers identify the obligatory context for the morpheme, that is, the places in which a sentence where the morpheme is necessary to make the sentence grammatically correct. For example, in the sentence, yesterday I played baseball for 2 hours, the adverb yesterday creates an obligatory context for a past tense, and for 2 hours tells us that the required form is simple past rather than past progressive. So these are two obligatory contexts in that sentence. And it's a way that we can also look at errors by looking at such kinds of contexts and seeing what kind of errors are made. And we do things called accuracy scores for the morphemes, the grammar morphemes. There is a similarity among learners suggests that accuracy order cannot be described or explained in terms of transfer from the learner's first language. And some researchers saw this as strong evidence against the contrastive analysis hypothesis. But there does seem to be a kind of a sequence. For example, negation. The acquisition of negative sentences by second language learners follows a path that looks nearly identical to the stages we saw for mainstream English language learners. And stage 1, one word, no bicycle, I no like it. Stage 2, no and not, may alternate with don't, he don't like it, I don't can sing. Stage 3, learners begin to place negative element after auxiliaries like are, is, and can. You cannot go there, he was not happy, she don't like rice. With Germans, they come not to home. In stage 4, the do is marked for tense, person, and number, and most interlanguage sentences appear to be just like those of the target language. It doesn't work, we didn't have supper. But some learners will mark tense, person, and number on both the auxiliary and the question. I didn't, went there, so that 2 double past tense. Also questions. Questions for second language learners come in stages. Stage 1, single words, formula, or sentence fragments, such as dog, 4 children, what's that? Stage 2, declarative word order, no inversion or no fronting. It's a monster in the right corner. The boys throw the shoes, using also rising intonation. And stage 3, the do fronting, the WH fronting without inversion. Do you have a shoes on your picture where the children are playing? Does in this picture there is 4 astronauts? Stage 4, inversion in the WH plus the copula, yes, no questions with other auxiliaries. Where is the sun? Is there a fish in the water? Like you, baseball? That's a German phrase. Magst du baseball? Stage 5, inversion with WH questions, both auxiliary and main verb. How do you say proche? What's the boy doing? French learners may have difficulty using stage 5 questions in which the subject is a noun rather than a pronoun. They may say and think it's grammatical, why do you like chocolate? But not why do children like chocolate? In this, they are drawing on French, where it's often ungrammatical to use inversion with a noun subject. Pourquoi aimer les enfants le chocolat? So, stage 6, complex questions with question tags. It's better, isn't it? Negative questions. Why can't you go? Embedded questions. Can you tell me what the date is today? So, tag questions are actually quite complex. Okay? So here's an activity for you using the information about the developmental sequence I just talked about. Circle the stage of the second language question development that best corresponds. So read all the questions before you begin, and I will give you the answer key in just a second. So here's the answer key. I will also put the Analyze Learners Question Survey in Brightspace so you can download it and then look at the key as well. So as you've guessed, there are developmental sequences for all kinds of things regarding language. Questions, negation, there's developmental sequences for possessives and possessive determiners. There's developmental sequences for relative clauses, references to the past, and there is movement. We've seen, as in first language acquisition, there's systematic and predictable developmental sequences in second language acquisition. But it's important to emphasize that the developmental stages are not like closed doors. Learners don't leave behind when they enter another room. They're actually, in examining language samples from individual learners, one should not expect to find behaviors from only one stage. They're just not that stable and that linear. Language is not a linear process, or learning language is not a linear process either. So let's talk a little bit more about the first language influence. So one reason that some researchers rejected the hypothesis that transfer or interference would best explain learner difficulty with target language is the fact that contrastive analysis was closely associated with behaviorist views of language acquisition. In rejecting the behaviorist view, some researchers also discarded contrastive analysis, but they lost some essential sources of information about language acquisition. So the influence of the first language on the second language is significant. For example, there are things that we can talk about. Patterns of other languages impact the patterns that the L2 learner puts on English or other languages that are being learned. And we've seen in some ways that the first language interacts with a developmental sequence. When learners reach a certain stage and perceive a similarity to their own language, they may linger longer at that stage. For example, the extended use of the preverbal no by Spanish speakers, or they may add a substage, for example, the German speakers' inversion of subject and lexical verbs in questions. The first language may influence learners' interlanguage in other ways as well. There may be some avoidance, as I've described, partly caused by learners' perception that a feature in the target language was so distant and different from their own first language that they preferred not to try it. There's also a degree of sensitivity to difference and a reluctance to attempt a transfer when they perceive languages are too different. Risk-taking is associated with the perception of similarity, but it has its limits. A scholar found that Dutch learners of English were reluctant to accept that certain idiomatic expressions or unusual uses of words were also possible in English. For example, the wave broke on the shore, they didn't accept, but they accepted he broke the cup, even though both translate straightforwardly into Dutch with the verb breken. Another way in which learners' first languages affect second language acquisition is by making it difficult for them to notice something they are saying is not a feature of the language as it is used by more proficient speakers. For example, the adverb placement in French and English. So let me show you an example of that. So here you can see that what works sometimes from French to English doesn't always work from French to English or English to French. And our understanding of the relationship between first and later learned languages has been refined. So we have this term cross-linguistic influence that's often used to reflect the fact that the relationship is by no means unidirectional, as you can see from this French example. Okay, that, it depends. It just depends. So this chapter has focused on acquisition of morphology and syntax in the second language, but now we're going to look at communicative competence, that is vocabulary, pragmatics, and pronunciation. So vocabulary is really important. We all know this from the PSYOP course, and the importance seems really clear, but it's often somewhat overlooked because of the way that vocabulary seems to be just right in our faces. An educated adult speaker of English is believed to know at least 20,000 words. There may even be 1 million words in the English language. Children learn thousands of words in their first language with little apparent effort. The first step to knowing a word is just to recognize the word identification. And then we have to start making associations with the word. And proficient speakers might even have problems with words depending on where they are classified and what kind of vocabulary they are. So I'm going to show you a little list. I call it the tricky list. So all of the words in list 1 look easy because they're one syllable, right? They're common words appearing to be about among the 1,000 most frequent words, and yet they are not likely to be known to students who have not had previous instruction in English or exposure to language outside of school. Furthermore, there's nothing in the written form or pronunciation of the words themselves that gives a clue to their meaning. If students are to learn them, they must see or hear the words in context that reveal their meaning, and as a rule, they must do this many times, some say up to 16 to 19 times, before the link between the word and its meaning is well established. So, if you look at list 2, some students who have never studied English might already know those words because they're part of an international vocabulary. And with increasing internationalization of communications, many languages have borrowed and adapted words from other languages. So you'd be surprised that students throughout the world learn many words that they already know in the language they're trying to learn, inadvertently. The words in list 3 look difficult. They're long, not easily illustrated, and most are fairly infrequent in the language. However, some students would either know them on sight or learn them after a single exposure because they look like their translation equivalent in other languages that they already know. Some words such as nation and dictionary are cognates, and others such as dormant and entente are borrowed words that have been adopted from other languages. The words that look alike and have shared meanings can help learners expand the vocabulary. So we shouldn't assume that students will always recognize borrowed words or cognates, and we should also be aware of the false cognates. So some theorists have argued that second language learners, like children learning their first language, can get a great deal of vocabulary with little effort. And Krashen asserted that the best way to learn is by reading. But there are problems with that because it depends on what you're reading. Different kinds of genres and different kinds of books have different kinds of vocabulary and sentence structures, and relying on learning through reading without focused instruction is not a good idea. So the other thing to think about is, what does it mean to really know a word? We've done an exercise in the summer about that. So according to Lightbrown and Spada, to know a word means several things: grasping the general meaning in a familiar context, providing a definition or translation equivalent, providing appropriate word associations, identifying its component parts or etymology, using the word to complete a sentence or create a new sentence, using the word metaphorically, understanding a joke that uses homonyms, and using the word in the correct communicative environment. So these are all parts of what we call pragmatics. So pragmatics is the study of how language is used in context to express things such as directness, politeness, and deference. So even if learners acquire a vocabulary of 5,000 words and have a good knowledge of syntax and morphology of the target language, they can still encounter difficulty using language. They need to acquire skills for interpreting requests, responding politely to compliments or apologies, recognizing humor, managing conversations, arguing, defending, debating, requesting, pleading, begging, all that stuff. And there are many ways that a very simple sentence can be interpreted. Take, for example, the idea of, "Is that your dog?" It could be admiration. "Is that your dog? Wow." Or is that your dog that's pooping on my yard? So really interesting field of study is pragmatics. There are different ways that language learners learn to make requests, that the pragmatic aspect of making requests has been studied. And they have 5 stages. Stage 1 consists of minimal language that is often incomplete and context dependent. Sir, help. Stage 2 includes memorized routines and frequent use of imperatives. Let's play the game. Let's eat breakfast. Don't look. Stage 3 is marked by less use of formulas, more productive speech, and some mitigation of requests. For example, can you pass the pencil, please? Can you do another one for me? Stage 4 involves more complex language and increased use of mitigation, especially supportive stuff. Could I have another chocolate because my children? I have 5 children. And stage 5 is marked by refinement in the force of the requests. It's fine-tuning. Is there any more white? You could put some blue tack down there, please. We also need to talk about phonology and how the audiolingual approach with segments and minimal pairs has gone on to communicative language teaching, to the suprasegmentals, the intonation patterns. And as you saw within the pragmatic idea of, "Is that your dog? Is that your dog?" The meaning is conveyed by the intonation rather than the actual text. So that is something that we'll talk about later. And this is all we have for this section now. So I hope this was enjoyable and useful.